Good. Hello. My name is Anthony Tas Tasgal. I'm a trainer, author, strategist. That's one of the ways of explaining what TAS stands for. And I've written a number of books, one of which is going to be coming out hopefully very soon, called The Insight Book. So we're talking to various people about what insight is, where it comes from, why it's important. And today, from the other side of the world, from where I am in North London, is Paul Croci, Commercial Director of CoreData Research, live from Perth in Australia. Morning, Paul, or afternoon.
Yeah, good morning to you, Tas.
Good. So,
Thanks for having me along.
yeah, it's a pleasure because I think insight is something that both you and I have talked about and we both worked in. And I think it's for me a fascinating topic that doesn't perhaps get enough scrutiny, which is one of the reasons I tried to write this book. So I thought I'd start off just looking at your company because I did notice that your tagline, your slogan, your positioning is data into insight and insight into action. So maybe that's not a bad place to start. So how did that idea come about, and why is insight so important to people like you?
Yeah, well, without making this too much of a plug for CoreData, one of the things that we kind of pride ourselves on is we don't just produce doorstopper reports. We do focus on the data, but the data in itself is a means to an end, and the end is insight. If you cannot find something that is of true meaning out of the data, then what are you doing with the data? But then again, insight of its own doesn't mean anything either unless you do something with it. And so that's why we put a lot of focus on helping our clients get from the data in the first place through to what's it actually saying to us, what is the insight, and then how do we actually utilize that for commercial or social benefit.
Yeah, by the way, for anyone who's viewing this, I do realize that Australian English and British English have much in common. The pronunciation of data is not one of them.
That's true. I'm defaulting to what's comfortable to me, sorry.
It's fair enough. No, I think one of the things that I'm fascinated by, having been an agency account planner, was I was always interested in what's not the means, but what's the end. And I always found many research companies would just sort of provide a deck, a doorstop full, and say, okay, this is what we've produced. And I said, no, I don't want that. I call that the vomit draft. After what Will Ferrell called his screenplays. I don't want the vomit draft. I want the insight. I want the meaning. Okay, now what do I do with this? So I think that's often where research companies perhaps go wrong.
Yeah, that's true. And the other thing that kind of underpins that is you will often do surveys that have got lots and lots of stuff in them, some of them, and that's a whole nother conversation. But then there's this feeling, and it's not just from the agencies, often it's from the clients, that, we asked it, we have to have a report on it. So everything tries to get thrown into a report. And in the end, I like that idea of the vomit draft. There is just so much in there that may not actually be relevant. So focus on what's the actual story here. What's the narrative? What's it actually telling us? And what is there that's useful that we can do something with?
Yeah, you mentioned story. And if I start talking about story, I'll be here all day, because as you know, that's my other topic.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's also that drove me to sort of try and write something about insight was it's one of those words that has lots of meaning or lots of meanings. I think you talked about having sort of hundreds of different types of meanings, and yet it's sort of quite elusive. So I mean, I don't know could you put a definition of insight into words for us? Or?
Yeah, insight's an interesting one. It has got many shifting meanings, at least that I've discovered in my career. I mean, I started off at a research agency, and we talked about trying to find the so what in the data, and that was essentially the insight. But the caveat was it was only related to the data set you were looking at. I've since spent a lot of my career on the client side instead and worked for various multinationals. And I found different definitions of insight. One in particular was excellent, where they talked about an insight being defined as a profound understanding of people's behaviors, attitudes, or beliefs that offers exciting business building opportunities. Sorry, I had to actually write that one down because it's quite a mouthful. But I like that because it talks about this idea of being a profound understanding, and it is kind of data agnostic. It can come from kind of anywhere or from more than one source. And that was really, really good. But then that rapidly became very prescriptive as well, because there were very specific ways in which you could generate an insight. And I remember when I started at that particular organization, and I was working with a brand manager, and we were looking at a couple of different reports, and I thought something was fairly evidently leaping out. And they said, "Oh, no, just park that. We're having an insights workshop next Thursday." I said, "Oh, okay, but we've got something interesting here. Shall we not progress that?" And no, there was a very formal way of getting to this insight, and it involved getting lots of different stakeholders together and lots of different data sets. And in itself, that wasn't necessarily a bad process, but it was very regimented in how you could work with information. And then also I've worked at companies where they say, "Oh, we've got plenty of insights." And you say, "Okay, well, give me an example." And they'll say, "Well, look at this report. 45% of people said this." Okay, yeah, well, that's a number, but what's the actual insight here?
I think it's a spectrum, and I talk about it. It's like sort of a fact, an observation, and an insight. And I think you're right. Insight, I mean, it's a classic word that's used a lot, is actionable. And as you say, it's got to prompt that. So what it's got to prompt some sort of way of seeing things differently. Because if you look at insight, the etymology of it, it's about seeing. So the whole point is, can you see something different that you wouldn't have before? And one of the definitions often, or the contrasts I often talk about, is information is to be collected, but insight is to be connected. So for me, insight is often about serendipity. So your story about, okay, let's have a workshop. For me, it's often when you let your brain, your system one in particular, roam free and not just look at the data, but find some other connection to something else. That's when you get the sort of aha, the eureka sort of moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know you talk about, and we may well talk about this further on in this conversation, but this idea that research, that the idea of insight has tried to be commandeered by the research industry. And one of the challenges I have with that, and one that we definitely try to circumvent at CoreData, is that it can't just be wedded to one source of truth, one data set. And often a research report or a data set can start to generate a glimmer of something, or it can generate an idea. But it's when you liberate it from that. I think you used the word liberate. I love that, because it liberates it from where it's sitting at the moment, and then it's connected to other things. So if you see it validated in other sources, or you connect it to a human truth that you have observed, or you've seen in patterns of behavior or in trends, that's when it becomes rich, and it becomes something that you can really see and use.
Yeah, I think one of the things, again, you just reminded me of, is I talk about often researchers will think insight comes if you stare long and longingly enough at data, and sometimes it will happen. But one of the things I'm trying to sort of just push the research industry towards, and I speak as a member of the UK Market Research Society, so I don't have my license revoked. 3 children, a cat to support. My feeling is that it's a creative exercise. And because
Absolutely.
I have an agency background where I'm used to working with creative people, which I always love working with creative people, I think perhaps the research industry needs to sort of just open up a bit and realize a lot of those skills are effectively creative skills. And they can be taught and they can be learned individually and culturally, collectively, corporately. But I think the research industry still remains rather narrowly focused just on the data. So that's what I keep sort of talking about, and it comes up a lot in the book.
I agree, and I really enjoyed seeing that in your book as well. And I've seen you do trainings on that very topic, this idea of creativity. It's so important. But the other thing I'll call out is, yes, a lot of research agencies do tend to focus on the project at hand, the report, the research they're conducting, the report they're delivering. And to their credit, there's a lot of fine people in the research industry who try to wring the most they can out of that. One of the things that, it could be because I've spent a lot of time on client side as well, one of the things that I love to do is actually start off any given research project with, what other data is available? What else have you done in the past? What do you have internally? Is there anything? And start with the real discovery phase. And that you'll probably like to hear this, but I love talking up front to the agencies as well, talking to the ad agency or the media agency and talking to the people who've worked on the account for a while and worked on the brand and getting their views on what they already know and what their hypotheses actually are. Because only then can you really start to get a sense of what is it we are going to be researching, but then also where does the insight actually lie? It doesn't just lie in the data that we're collecting, it lies in the minds of these other people who have worked on the brand as well, or these other data sources that can be combined with the research project. And I think that's one of the areas where the research industry can possibly improve.
I remember I used to put up that Darwinian picture, which isn't real, but it's the idea that, you progress from sort of apes to people standing up to spears to whatever. And I occasionally used to put like researchers at one end and ad agency planners at the other end, which was great for some people, really annoyed lots of others, as you can imagine.
I wonder why.
But there's a bit of truth in that, because again, for planners and agency people, it is all about, okay, what are we looking for? We're looking for making our clients more distinctive, better positioning, reframing the brand, and research and insight is the means, as I said before, to that end. And as I think we talked about before I started, I'm obsessed with sort of Latin and etymology. And one of the things I love talking about is the word error, which we always take as being a mistake or failure. But actually, if you look at the etymology, errare, which again is
humanum est.
Exactly, errare is human, but errare actually means to wander, which we still find the English word erratic. So when you're driving erratically, you're wandering. Also, aberrant behavior means behavior that's abnormal, wandering from the norm. So I always say to people, when you're looking for insight, wandering, errare is good. You will make mistakes, but you'll only come up with insights if you wander. So for me, again, some of those ways of looking at serendipity and wandering and the idea of ideas colliding, for me, those are much more fruitful ways of thinking about insight than, as I say, just sort of monochromatically looking at data.
I love that. This idea of wandering. I mean, often when I coach young new analysts, I will encourage them to wander in the data. Just see where it takes you. Don't immediately think, aha, I've seen a number. 45% of people do this. Aha. Ask yourself, well, what would that mean if they did? Actually, 55% of people don't. What does that mean? Toy with these things, wander in it and see where it takes you and ask yourself other questions. And perhaps the answer doesn't actually lie in that data set, perhaps it lies somewhere else. But that's where you end up with some kind of insight rather than just we've done this report. It's really good.
One of the other things you just mentioned again, which ties in with some of my other areas, because you mentioned storytelling, which I really wish we had time to talk about storytelling, and behavioral economics. And behavioral economics emphasizes the importance of making things emotionally rewarding and satisfying, and also fun and playful and gamification. And again, all of those words I think are absolutely core to getting to insights. That's why creative people, whether they're scientists, artists, people who work in agencies, whatever, that's why they spend so much of their time playing, because that is, rather than just seriously looking at, the way things have to be, the idea of playfulness is just examining things critically, not taking things for granted. And again, for me, that's one of the royal roads to insight that, again, perhaps the research industry needs to think a little bit more about. I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, but one of the things that I'm quite interested in is there was a quote I found just randomly in a novel by Saul Bellow. And he talks about a character being a first-class noticer.
Oh, I love that.
And I love that expression. And at the end of the book, I've come up with a word cloud, all these things. So impertinence, wandering, storyteller, analogist. But I think first-class noticers, and again, I think one of the things that research industry could do well to sort of put into practice is who it hires. I think, again, you can look at people who've come from other backgrounds, but who are first-class noticers. They're not people who just think about data and methodology, but they notice things. They're good at observation of human behavior and traits and foibles and whims. And again, I think for me, that's something where maybe agency folk are perhaps more primed to do that. I mean, ad agency folk, if you like, rather than sort of researchers who perhaps limit themselves to their particular sort of sector and project.
That's an interesting perspective. I think often when we recruit, at least in the research world, when we recruit for people, we'll often give them a case study, and that involves giving them some data to look at and report back on what's really interesting here. How would you tell the story of what you see in there? You might give some company information or context. But perhaps, to your point of noticing, perhaps that's not necessarily the best way to do it. Maybe it is more around giving them a few abstract things and seeing what they notice out of those abstract things and how they tie them together. And perhaps that's a better indicator of someone who's going to be more insightful than others.
Yeah. So I think I'll end up by trying to tie up, as you said, a couple of the thoughts. Because I often talk about in the books, including the first storytelling book. I haven't got the new one ready with me at the moment, but I talk about the golden thread. And again, I think one of the things that for me isn't just about finding insight, which is mainly what we've talked about, but how you transmit or share insight and make it actionable. And again, for me, we talked about the vomit draft. For me, I want, when I'm being shown a presentation or data, I want a thread that is a story that I can understand, that I can take in, but also I can transmit to other sort of stakeholders and clients. So again, I think part of insight is not just finding it, but how you communicate it to those who need to do something with it, who need to turn it into action. And for me, again, that's one of the neglected areas of insight. Good. I think that's about
to excite people about it. That's the thing.
You have. I mean, I do use the word incitement. I think you mentioned it. For me, it's a deliberate play on various words. So obviously, it's got the word insight in it. It's got a reference to the verb incite, I-N-C-I-T-E, which means to provoke. But also incitement for me has also a sort of reference to excitement, because I think an insight should be exciting. And I'll often say
Absolutely.
to baby planners or researchers or students, if I'm excited by what you said, there's a good chance that's an insight. If you're not excited by it and I'm not excited, it's probably not an insight.
It's probably a number.
Probably just a number or something that you think mildly amusing or mildly interesting. Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Paul.
My pleasure.
Fascinating. I think we probably could have gone on for several more hours, days. But I hope everyone who's watching, listening to this finds something useful in it. I will put hopefully a link onto the book. Paul as well will have some links to CoreData, sorry. And I will.
How do you say it?
Yeah, it doesn't sound natural to me, but I'm trying. Thank you all for your time again, Paul. I'll let you get back to your family and other commitments. I'm going to go and water my cat. Thank you all for your time and speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Thanks, Tas.